Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. Last month, Teagasc launched its latest version of the Marginal Abatement Cost Curve, also known as the MACC, which will assist farmers and the agriculture sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. During the launch, Teagasc Director Professor Frank O'Mara said that the Teagasc 2023 MACC shows that there is a technology pathway for the agriculture sector to meet its obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it requires a very high uptake of the currently available mitigation measures and future technologies to achieve that. So to discuss the MACC, the new MACC in detail, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Gary Lanigan, who's Research Officer at Teagasc in Johnstown Castle. Gary, good morning to you.
Hi, Mark.
And Pat Murphy, you're going to help us with questions later on.
Will do.
Thanks, Pat. And so, Gary, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in this whole space in climate action.
Yeah, so I suppose I've been working on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture for, I'd say, the past 18, 19 years now. And in particular, I work on carbon sequestration and nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soils. So really, then I kind of fell into doing the MACC really around about 11, 12 years ago on the first iteration. And then foolishly took it on in the second iteration and now the third iteration. So the first time we produced the MACC, I think it was about 20 or 30 pages long. Second one was 87 pages, and this is topping in at 353 pages. So it's got a little bit bigger every time we do it.
A huge amount of science backing this latest version.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So, Gary, you're going to step us through this latest version. So you have a presentation if you'd like to share that with us.
I will indeed. Okay, so again, before I start, I would like to thank my co-authors, who are various. 90% of them are all from Teagasc. Two, though, who I'd like to in particular thank, who are non-Teagasc: Kevin Black from Furs Limited. And also John Redmond from the Forestry Service and the Department of Agriculture, who were both very vital in assisting us with the forestry parts of the MACC. And then, of course, I would like to thank all of my Teagasc colleagues. While I write the MACC and give the MACC, I am standing literally on the shoulders of my colleagues who do all of the scientific research. So big thanks to them. So first of all, what is a MACC? Why do we need it? A MACC essentially is a marginal abatement cost curve, is a visual way of setting out mitigation options, and it was originally designed by McKinsey's consultants, and they did it. They devised this method of viewing mitigation options in order to allow policymakers and stakeholders to see in quite a visual way which mitigation options were the least cost, and to be able to generate a least cost pathway towards achieving targets and achieving reductions in emissions. So essentially, the MACC ranks measures from the least expensive to the most expensive. So it's easy to see how much mitigation will be delivered, but also the cost per tonne of CO2 equivalents that it will take to actually reduce emissions. We last published the MACC in 2018, so 5 years ago. Why are we doing a new MACC now? Well, first of all, we've had a huge amount of new science over the last 5 years, so science doesn't remain static. And secondly, the policy landscape has changed very, very significantly. So 5 years ago, we had no sectoral targets. We had no national target in terms of the, there was no Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. Now there is. We have a national target reducing emissions by 51% by 2030, and we have a sectoral target of reducing agricultural emissions by 25% by 2030. And similar to the previous MACC, we actually produced 3 separate MACCs. We do one for agriculture, one for land use change and forestry, and one for bioenergy sector. And that's because these are all ancillary sectors that are also very related to agriculture. So in terms of key considerations, in the MACC, we've looked at 3 activity scenarios. So we've looked at a range of different animal numbers, and I'll come on to this in a second. So the main scenario we look at is what we call S1, scenario 1, and that's the business as usual scenario. And this is used by the EPA, for example, in their projections of where agricultural emissions will be by 2030. And then we also have an S2, which is a lower activity scenario, and S3, which is a stretch target, a higher activity scenario for agriculture. One thing that's very different about this MACC is that we have 2 different adoption pathways. So we have 2 levels of ambition in terms of adoption of measures. Pathway 1, which is the very high, which is the high uptake pathway, and pathway 2, which is the very, very high uptake pathway. And I apologize for the lack of imagination in terms of the naming of these adoption pathways. We thought about different names such as moderate and enhanced, or low and high, but the reality is even pathway 1 is a relatively high adoption pathway, and pathway 2 really is a stretch target. So we have 2 levels of adoption, but then we also have different speeds of adoption. So the rate at which method or mitigation measures are taken up. So for some of the more well-known measures, such as protected urea, for example, or clover or liming, we assume linear uptake of measures. So that is, the measures are taken up at a constant rate year on year. For some new measures, such as methane inhibitors, we have what's called a sigmoidal uptake. So we have very little uptake at the start, and then right at the end, in the last couple of years, we have very, very high levels of uptake as as these mitigation options become more mature and much more well known. And then for other mitigation measures, such as low emission slurry spreading, we front load the mitigation. So we have different speeds of uptake for different measures. This time as well, one important thing we've done is separate out efficiency measures. So efficiency measures are things such as animal health, such as breeding for beef and dairy cattle, things like terminal indices and maternal indices. And we've separated those out this time because while they reduce the carbon footprint, and it still, of course, is incredibly vital that we reduce the carbon footprint of beef and of milk produce, they don't necessarily impact on absolute emissions. So, for example, while sex semen will improve the carbon efficiency of milk and of meat production, it may in fact increase overall greenhouse gases from the sector. So these efficiency measures reduce the carbon footprint. They don't necessarily reduce total emissions. Okay. Important though, one important thing to say about them is particularly things like animal health and genetics and extended grazing. They're enablers for other measures, such as reducing the age of slaughter. So if you want to be able to reduce the age of slaughter and be able to improve live weight gain, you need genetics, you need animal health, and you need things like extended grazing. In terms of LULUCF and energy, we're only looking at one scenario, unlike agriculture, where we're looking at 2 levels of adoption. Okay, so the next thing I'll deal with is the 3 activity scenarios. Now, in the media and post the publication of the MACC, these scenarios were seen or were certainly reported as Teagasc advocating reductions in the suckler herd or increases in the dairy herd or whatever, and they are not Teagasc recommendations. These are simply agricultural economic projections. So we use an economic model called a FAPRI model. And what the FAPRI model does is it, assuming current policy and assuming current macroeconomic conditions, it projects out what agricultural activity, i.e. dairy cow numbers, suckler cow numbers, and fertilizer use will be by 2030 under, and I will restate it, under current economic conditions and under current policy conditions. So essentially, what we have seen over the last number of years is a slow but steady reduction in the suckler herd. And all the FAPRI model is doing is extrapolating that reduction out to 2030. Okay, so under scenario 1, which is our business as usual scenario, we project there'll be just under 1.7 million dairy cows by 2030, 632,000 suckler cows by 2030, and we will have we'll be using somewhere in the region just under 400,000 tons of nitrogen by 2030. Scenario 2 and scenario 3, these are basically scenarios where we have said, okay, well, what happens if animal numbers are lower or animal numbers are higher than the baseline projection? So scenario 2 is again, it's just there for illustration, for illustrating what would happen if there was a lower increase in dairy numbers and a higher decrease in suckler numbers. And again, scenario 3 is showing what would happen if there was stronger growth in dairy numbers and a much lower reduction in suckler numbers. Okay, and what you can see is that between the lowest scenario, scenario 2, you have emissions of 21.1 million tons from the sector, and the highest is under scenario 3, where you have the higher number of bovines and the highest amount of fertilizer, 421,000 tons, and you can see it's 22.8. So there's a 1.7 million ton spread between the lowest scenario and the highest scenario. But in scenario 1, which is our business as usual scenario, we're projecting that without mitigation, our emissions will be somewhere around about 22 million tons by 2030. Okay, we have a target to reach, and that's 17.25 million tons. So we're a fair bit away from that without mitigation. So the next question is, how can we actually achieve our targets? Let's look at that. So the first thing I'll do is give you a very quick refresher on how to read a MACC. So what you can see is a number of bars. The bars are all different shapes and sizes. Some of them are below the x-axis line. Some of them are above the x-axis line. And basically, the two things to bear in mind is the width of the bar is probably the most important thing, because the width of the bar indicates the amount of greenhouse gases a measure will abate. So the wider and fatter the bar, the more mitigation the option is doing. The height of the bar indicates the cost. So if you've got a very high bar, it's quite a costly measure. And converse to this, if the bar is below the x-axis and the lower the bar is below the x-axis, the more cost negative it is. So if it's below the x-axis, happy days, it's a cost negative measure. So you actually save money by implementing it. So that's how to read a MACC. So here is the MACC for pathway 1. So when we looked at pathway 1 level of adoption, and what we calculated was that we could reduce emissions by 2,820 kilotons. So that's 2,820,000 tons of CO2 by 2030. So 2.8 million tons essentially. So what are the main measures that can do? So the other thing that always strikes me when I look at these MACCs is that there's no silver bullet here. So there's not one bar that's nice and broad and that's delivering most of the reduction. And what you see is that, but there are 3 or 4 measures that do stick out. So first of all, reduced age of finishing is the largest, most effective measure. It's also cost negative. Okay, and that's delivering around about 15% of the total mitigation. That's reduced age of finishing of beef animals. And here, under Pathway 1, we're reducing the age of finishing by 2 months. Secondly, fertilizer formulation. Again, delivers about 14% of the total reduction. And the fertilizer formulation consists of two main parts. The use of protected urea instead of straight urea, or instead of straight calcium ammonium nitrate. And secondly, the use of ammonium fertilizers, so 18-6-12s, for example, or 10-10-20s, instead of nitrate-based fertilizers, that is 27-2.5-5s. So they're the 2 most effective measures. Then we have dairy EBI. So dairy EBI would have normally been only in the efficiency MACC previously, but research from Moorpark has been showing that the high EBI animals within the dairy herd there are actually showing lower methane emissions per unit milk than low EBI animals. So there is an actual benefit of EBI on actual methane emissions, with higher EBI animals having lower methane. And finally then, the last one we have is feed additives. And feed additives don't kick in until towards near the end of the decade. These and the 2 main feed additives here, mainly 3-NOP, and mainly being fed under Pathway 1 during the housing period. And what you can see is that, again, this is going to deliver somewhere in the region of 12% of the total abatement by 2030, but again, only in the last 2 or 3 years. So in terms of Pathway 1, the thing to ask then, does Pathway 1 get us to our target? So there's our target. We have to reduce from what we project as 22 million tonnes by 2030 down to 17.25 million tonnes. Do we get there? The answer is no. Pathway 1 will only give us a mitigation of 2.8 million tonnes, which means we'll be at 19.1 million tonnes by 2030, i.e. we will not make the target. So then we looked at Pathway 2. This is Pathway with much higher levels of adoption, and you can see suddenly the bar broadens out. And essentially, Pathway 2, the headline is it delivers 4.85 million tonnes, or 4,858 kilotons of CO2 abatement by 2030. Okay. Again, what are the main measures here? So quite similar to the last one. We have, again, feed additives, and feed additives under this scenario is the most important measure, and that's because we're now feeding a lot of these inhibitors during the grazing period to dairy cows. And in this case, we're using, again, 3-NOP, but also things like seaweeds and in particular halides, which is a new product by a Galway company, Glassport Bio, and importantly, that can be fed to animals during grazing, and it gives about a 20% reduction in methane emissions. Okay, so here we see a much larger impact, almost a megaton of 1 million tonnes of reduction from the feed additives, and it accounts for about 15% of total emissions reduction. Again, reduced age of finishing is highly important under this pathway, and here we're moving to a 3-month reduction in the age of finishing, and again, it's delivering around about 14% of total mitigation. Fertilizer formulation, again, the use of protected urea, the use of ammonium-based compounds, and then also we're starting to put in a little bit of protected urea with a nitrification inhibitor, replacing about 15 to 20% of calcium ammonium nitrate here, and this delivers about 11 to 12% of our total emissions mitigation. And then we have a new measure in here, which is diversification impacts. And essentially what this is the amount of animals that would be displaced by uptake of organic farming, of growing feedstock for a vibrant biomethane industry. And in particular, this diversification impact measure becomes important because we are now providing feedstock for 5.7 terawatt hours of biomethane. And we estimate that the diversification impacts, the displacement of animals that would occur for land for afforestation, land for organics, land for biomethane feedstock, or the extension of tillage would displace somewhere in the region of about 137,000 livestock units. And those amounts of livestock units could be made up of a combination of cattle and of sheep. And that delivers about 10% of our total reduction. So Pathway 2 delivers 4.8 million tonnes of CO2 abatement. Again, we have a target of 17.25, and do we reach it? And we do, just about by the skin of our teeth. Pathway 2 will deliver a sector that would be emitting 17 million tonnes by 2030. Okay, so here in this table here, we have a combination of all the different scenarios, the activity scenarios times the pathway. And what you see is that, in fact, only two of these combinations make your target. That's scenario 1, which is the business as usual scenario, or scenario 2, which is the lower animals numbers scenario, in combination with pathway 2 mitigation. And what you see is for both of those scenarios times adoption pathways, you would actually make the target as set out under the Climate Action Plan. So the question then is, pathway 1 and pathway 2, well, you know, what are the levels of uptake in these pathways? So if we look and we focus mainly on pathway 2, what you can see is we're talking about a reduction in chemical nitrogen to about 286,000 tonnes of nitrogen by 2030. So this goes beyond what was in Acclimatise. Acclimatise set a target of 300,000 tonnes of nitrogen by 2030. In order to achieve the targets under the Climate Action Plan, we would require a 30% reduction to about 286,000 tonnes of nitrogen by 2030. You're talking about the total replacement of straight urea with protected urea, the almost total replacement, over 90% replacement of calcium ammonium nitrate with protected urea, and a 65% replacement of nitrate-based compounds with ammonium-based compounds. You're talking about a reduction in the age of finishing for both suckler and dairy beef of somewhere in the region of 3 months. You're talking about 50% of feed additives being fed to dairy cows during the grazing season, and 65% inclusion of feed additives in all bovine diets during the housing period. As I said, for displacement, you're talking about the displacement of 137 to 138,000 livestock units, and then a biomethane industry, and that's mainly driven by biomethane industry. And then also resulting from that biomethane industry is a generation of about 3.5 million cubic meters of digestate, which could be then used to displace fertilizer emissions even further. And then you've also got manure management, so slurry aeration, slurry acidification on 40% of dairy farms and 20% of other livestock farms. So very, very high levels of adoption required to reach these targets. And in fact, far higher levels of adoption than could probably be achieved by advisory and extension services alone. So second, if we look at land use change, again, pathway 1 and pathway 2 we have here. And what we see under pathway 1 is LULUCF can deliver 2.3 million tonnes of mitigation by 2030. And in terms of pathway 2, it can deliver over 4 million tonnes, 4.1 million tonnes of mitigation by 2030. And again, what you can see is that you've no silver bullet. However, the one thing that does stick out is the water table management on peat soils. So here we're altering the water table on 80,000 hectares of grassland on peat soils. Now, we did this analysis before a recent Teagasc paper that came out stating that the amount of actually drained grassland on peat soils was actually much lower than is in our national inventory. And the inventory assumes just under 340,000 hectares of land that's drained on peat soils, grassland on peat soils. However, the study that my colleagues Pat Toohey, Owen Fenton, Lillian O'Sullivan and Conor Bracken did, they've surmised that amount is probably between 80 and 120,000 hectares. So re-wetting up 80,000 hectares could be almost all of the agricultural land that's on drained peat soils. So again, a very, very high target to reach. We also then have grassland management here. So grassland management, so that's things like getting your pH right, getting clover in, getting multi-species swards in on about 760,000 hectares of land. Hedgerows, we're talking about between 20 and 40,000 hectares of new or kilometers of new hedgerows, and then managing existing hedgerows better, allowing them to grow out a metre and up a metre. And that can again deliver a reasonable amount of mitigation. And then the one thing that does come out of here is how little mitigation afforestation can do to 2030. So afforestation is going to be incredibly important for reaching climate neutrality by 2050. But because we've had very, very low levels of afforestation up to now, over the last 3 years, we've been averaging somewhere in the region about 2,500 hectares of afforestation per annum. So afforestation out to 2030 will deliver very little mitigation, about 200,000 tonnes or so. What will deliver much more mitigation will be adjusting and extending the age of rotation. So if you simply extend the age of rotation of forest stands to what we term the mean maximum annual increment, you actually end up with more wood, and you just need to extend the age of rotation by 7 to 8 years. Okay, so in terms of LULUCF, what is the impact on emissions? So the first thing to bear in mind is that under business as usual, LULUCF emissions, land use change emissions, are projected to grow very, very significantly over the next number of years. And that's because A, we have a lot of grasslands on organic soils that emit an awful lot of carbon, and B, our forestry sink is disappearing over the next number of years, and that's because A, we've had low rates of afforestation, and B, our forestry is in the cycle, and the age profile of our forestry means we're clear felling a lot of our forests over the next 7 to 8 years. So our emissions are due to grow. We haven't got a climate action plan target, so there's no sectoral target at the moment for land use change in forestry. There is, however, a hard EU target, which is to reduce emissions by 13.6% relative to 2016 to 2018 levels. So this is the target. What you can see is under pathway 1, we don't make the target. And again, under pathway 2, we just about scrape and make that target. So again, high rates of adoption needed to make a target. What's in that pathway 1, pathway 2? So under pathway 2, both pathways have the same level of afforestation, 8,000 hectares per annum up to 2030, reduced deforestation on just under 500 hectares per annum, a 31% to extend the age of rotations on 31% of our forest estate. In terms then of enhancing grassland sequestration, optimizing soil nutrition, grazing intensity, and putting in clover on just over 750,000 hectares of grassland, raising the water table on 80,000 hectares of peat soils. Now, when I say raising the water table, it doesn't need to be all the way to the surface, so we're not talking about flooding the land necessarily. It could be simply raising it to, between 20 and 30 centimeters below the surface, planting of 40,000 kilometers of new hedgerows, and optimally managing another 75,000 kilometers. So again, very, very high targets to reach. Lastly, we talk about bioenergy, and here you do have a couple of silver bullets. So the use of wood energy contributes quite significantly, over 50% of the total of fossil fuel displacement. And then also reaching the biomethane target contributes over a third. So again, you're talking about very, very high levels of biomethane. You're talking about by 2030 having somewhere in the region of 200 biomethane plants in the country. Okay. As you can see, they're all cost negative, because when we were generating these MACCs, the price of energy was very high. However, under lower gas prices, biomethane can be quite costly. So in fact, there's a huge stretch in the cost range of biomethane, and that depends on the price of the feedstock, that is grass silage, and also the price of a kilowatt hour of gas. But again, you can see biomethane can contribute very significantly, over 2 million tonnes under Pathway 1, and over 3 million tonnes, 3.3 million tonnes under Pathway 2. And again, on bioenergy under Pathway 2, very ambitious targets for biomethane, and also very ambitious targets for displacement of solid fossil fuels. So just to end up, what are the key messages here? So agriculture really can reach its target, but it will require very, very high adoption rates of measures as outlined in Pathway 2. These are extremely challenging. And in fact, they're challenging to the extent that increased advisory and extension services will, of course, be key to helping to guide farmers and landowners on the pathway to both achieving the 2030 targets and furthermore to achieving climate neutrality. But while increased and extension services will be vital, the levels of uptake under Pathway 2 are beyond what advisory and peer learning can deliver alone, and there will be a need for clear policy guidance. Reductions in land use change emissions of greater than 14%, which is the EU target, would require new science and inventory refinement. Otherwise, it is literally impossible to reach a higher target for the land use sector. Agriculture and land use source energy substitution can significantly contribute to energy sector decarbonisation, almost 10% of the energy sector's target. But of course, fossil fuel substitution from grass, grown on farms and fed into bioreactors, or from trees that are grown on land, they contribute to the energy sector's decarbonisation. They don't count to the agricultural sector. Just to bear that in mind. And finally, continuing research and development, both in terms of mitigation technologies and inventory adjustments to get measures into the inventory so we can count them, remains a big priority for us in order both to achieve our 2030 and 2050 targets. So thank you very much for your attention today.
Gary, thanks so much. really, really clear presentation. I don't think I've seen the MACC ever so clearly presented. So appreciate that there's effort that goes into that. So I think it's very clear to me that the size of the challenge. And I mean, you haven't you've been quite unflinching in the way you've presented that. That's the scenario 2 in particular is there's high levels of adoption required there. You made an interesting comment there a few times around that these targets won't be achieved alone through advisory support and knowledge, that there will be incentives required. I mean, have you considered the types of incentives or what sort?
No, absolutely not, Mark. And we're always very clear on this, and I'm always very clear in particular. We are there to provide the scientific information that feeds into policy, but we do not do policy. That's left up to the policymakers. However, if you want to, replace 100% of straight urea with protected urea, it doesn't take a genius to work out what sort of policies would be required there.
Yeah.
So there's we have been talking to our colleagues in the Department of Agriculture, because they're quite keen to adopt the MACC, translate the MACC into policy. So we provide them with the scientific basis, and they then make the policy based on that scientific basis. So science-based policy is always better than policy that's not guided by any science.
Yeah, I know that's very clear, Gary. Just in terms of the figures in the last number of years, like what sort of a trajectory are we on in terms of the reduction of emissions and also the adoption of some of these technologies, the likes of the less?
And and this is always an interesting one because it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Certainly since the 2018 MACC, emissions have generally risen. So in those 5 years, they've risen in 3 of those last 5 years. Now, we did see a 1.3% reduction in emissions last year, driven primarily by a reduction in fertilizer use, and more of a stabilization in animal numbers. There had been, of course, very strong growth in dairy cow numbers over the last number of years that were driving up methane emissions, counterbalanced to a certain degree by a reduction in suckler cow numbers, and the sheep numbers had generally stabilized off. But in general, we were seeing increases, certainly since the abolition of milk quotas, and even slightly prior to that. We've been seeing a general trend towards an upward trend in emissions, with a couple of years where those emissions have gone down. But hopefully, I think now what we've seen is probably a leveling off of agricultural emissions, and I would expect the trend to be downwards now over the next few years. How we've done in terms of the actual mitigation options, say that we're in the 2018 MACC, so we've had very strong uptake in low emission slurry spreading. We've had strong interest in protected urea. I think the issue that there's been around protected urea has been around availability in co-ops, and again, that's something that needs to be tackled. We've had very, very strong uptake of dairy EBI, of course. So some of the other measures, such as some of the manure management measures and things like clover now and multi-species swards, certainly over the last 2 to 3 years, has seen a huge upsurge in interest. So again, that's been good news. And then on the tillage front, strong corporation cover cropping, of course, has been fairly strong.
We have some really, really excellent questions coming through, so I think we'll go straight into the questions. And sure, Pat, there's quite a few coming through, so we can share them between us.
Yeah, okay. There's a question there. Looking at the MACC and all the measures, if all were implemented by dairy farmers, for example, would the overall cost be negative or positive?
The overall cost would be negative for dairy farmers. And the reason for that is mainly because dairy EBI is so strongly cost negative. Dairy EBI skews everything. Now, if you were to take dairy EBI out and just look at the rest of the other measures, you'd be more or less cost neutral between the measures that cost money, such as feed additives, versus the measures that are cost negative, such as clover or liming.
So the message there is that dairy farmers, if they try to adopt all of them, they won't be out of pocket.
They won't be out of pocket. But the one thing I would say that's very, very important is that if you're putting clover in your sward, or if you're altering your soil pH, you need to cut your fertilizer by the amount of nitrogen you save. Otherwise, you're A, not going to save any emissions, and B, you're not going to save any money.
Okay. Question there: how is reducing finishing age by 2 months cost negative? And just point, if weather conditions do not allow longer grazing season, will feed not need to be introduced?
Okay, so again, this will change from farm to farm, but in general, reducing the cost of production by reducing by 2 to 3 months, and of course optimizing your beef genetics, optimizing your animal health. The reduction in carcass weight will be offset by the reduction in the cost of production over those 3 months. So again, that's work that's come out of our colleagues in Grange.
Okay. There's a question here: where are the sources of the assumptions available in terms of the calculation of the MACC and the pathways? I presume just search for Teagasc MACC on Google, and you'll get.
So if you so the Teagasc MACC, if you put in Teagasc MACC, you'll be led to where our MACC is. So there's 2 documents up there. There's a 15-page summary for stakeholders that gives everything in a much more digestible format. Otherwise, you can download the full document from the website as well. And in terms of the calculations, there's about 126 pages of appendices with all the calculations in there. So you can go knock yourself out and go through them all.
Okay. There's I suppose a question there in relation to how difficult it's going to be, and to what degree do you see the targets as stretch targets?
It is a stretch target, and originally when we looked at Pathway 2, it wasn't done for the purpose of meeting the target. It was done to see, how far could we go, or how. While we weren't at the biophysical limit necessarily of all of the measures, we wanted to see, what was the stretchiest target that we could meet, and it just so happened that it actually did meet the actual target as laid down under the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. Now, so what it does mean is, as I said, that they're incredibly challenging targets, and again, things like Connected Here, things like the advisory service to Signpost Farms will be really key to helping farmers on that pathway. But to put all of the onus on advisory and education alone would be, I think, highly unfair to our colleagues, to you guys in advisory. It's going to take more than just advisory and education.
There's a question here in relation to the feed additives, and to what degree, I suppose, some experience with the protected urea. To what degree are we going to have the availability of product, and to what degree is it going to add substantial cost to dairy production in particular? So
the cost is about €80 per head. So there is a reasonably substantial cost. 3NOP will be licensed for indoor use in dairy cows, I'd say, in the next 12 months. So it'll be commercially available within the next 12 months. I think what we're hoping is that either a bolus will be developed for 3NOP, or that other chemicals, other inhibitors such as halides, where you only have to feed them once a day to a cow, will come onto the market, and those halides then, because you're only feeding them once a day, you get a reduction then over the full 24 hours. So again, we're hoping that and there's a huge amount of work going on in Grange and Moore Park in Athenry, looking at this in both in dairy systems, and beef systems, and sheep systems. At looking at, and again, some of these other inhibitors are actually much lower cost than 3-NOP, and you'd also see what you tend to see is these technologies tend to be quite expensive at the start, but then as you get more of them produced, that their price comes down quite substantially over time.
Gary, there was a few questions in relation to the biomethane calculations, and one in relation to the feedstock used. Is it grass silage, or what type?
It's a mixture of grass silage and slurry. So there's 3 main areas of mitigation from biomethane. There's the biomethane displacement of fossil fuels themselves. There's also the fact that you're feeding slurry straight into anaerobic digester, so you save on methane associated with manure management. And then, of course, digestate that's produced out at the end. And there's good and bad things about that digestate. So the digestate that's produced, all of the nitrogen is available, which is great as a fertilizer replacement, but so it can also be bad for ammonia unless it's processed properly and it's spread in the right way. So again, we would see that digestate is probably having to be acidified maybe, or certainly have to be post-processed. It could be separated, for example, between the liquid fraction that contains all the nitrogen and the solid fraction that contains the P and K.
Yeah, and that technology is around. And I think
particularly colleagues up in AFBI and in Queens are doing a lot of work on slurry separation and post-processing.
And I understand that the grass silage would be based on a sort of a red clover type system. Is that?
Can be, yeah. So it can be again, colleagues in Grange, Kira Bosang, who's a recent recruit. They're looking at red clover systems. They're also looking at grass clover systems in combination with slurry. So they would be the main, the kind of the agriculturally based biomethane feedstocks, that they would be generally tend to be the feedstocks we'd be looking at.
So would you say it's pretty inevitable now that the whole biomethane industry is going to see quite an expansion in Ireland over the next?
Yeah, it's certainly Gas Networks Ireland are very enthusiastic about it. I think it will probably needs a bit of a kickstart from the government, so a little bit of joined up thinking, I think, between the relevant government departments will probably be required, but certainly the private sector seems to be starting to gear up. But I mean, trying to get 200 plants built and through planning and everything by 2030 is going to be incredibly challenging.
Hey, Gary, a technical and probably not a simple question. How will GWP star versus GWP 100 adjust the MACC curve?
Yeah, so we did actually investigate the impact of GWP star because it is a live issue. And what you tend to see, again, you have to adjust the target for GWP star as well. But what you would tend to see is that under GWP star, pathway 1 would actually get you to where you need to go, and that's because with GWP star, the reduction in methane, if you can get methane being reduced, is amplified by around about a factor of 3 under GWP star. But the health warning on that is if you get increases in methane, they're also amplified by a factor of 3. So the methane has to be going down and going down consistently.
There's a couple of questions in relation to AD, one around fugitive emissions of biomethane and the other around potential ammonia emissions from the digestate and from potential aeration.
Yeah.
And three
So
together.
yeah, so you've again, there's a huge risk with digestate of increasing ammonia emissions because, as I said, all of the nitrogen is in the form of ammoniacal or available nitrogen. So that digestate does need to be treated. We're very clear on that within the MACC. In terms of aeration, again, it's a very good question. So particularly the older style aerators, what we used to see was very good for reducing methane emissions, very bad for ammonia emissions. However, there are newer style aerators that don't have a huge amount of ammonia emissions or extra ammonia associated with them, but do see a reduction in methane.
Okay. There's, I suppose, a general question. What program and actions would you expect to be required to reach the levels of mitigation that are set out in the MACC?
Yeah, I suppose so. I break it down into two pieces. So for the first carbon budget, we're set two carbon budgets. First one is up to 2025, and the second one is 2026 to 2030. So for the first carbon budget in particular, I think we need to go aggressively at reducing nitrogen. So get your pH right. For every pH unit, you shift your soil pH, say from 5.5 up to 6.5. You release about 70 kilos of nitrogen. You also release phosphorus. So again, that means you can cut back your mineral fertilizer. Similarly, if you put legumes in, put in clover, multi-species swards, etc., they'll fix somewhere between 80 and 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So get your pH right, get clover in if you can. Use your slurry as judiciously as you can as well. Spread by low emission slurry spreading, again, saves on nitrogen fertilizer. But doing all these measures and not reducing your nitrogen fertilizer will end us up in a worse position. So you need to be cutting your nitrogen fertilizer, and nitrogen fertilizer is still quite expensive. So and then any of the mineral nitrogen you have left behind, move over to protected urea, move over to 18-6-12.
I presume the usual caveat when it comes to liming, Gary, is where it's in sensitive areas. That needs
sensitive
to be
areas, HNVs. Yeah, you've got to be really careful about that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Question here, Gary, just in relation, we talked about the role of government policymakers and advisory services, but where do you see the role of processors, the agri-food businesses fitting in to support and drive and encourage the adoption of on-farm mitigation?
Yeah, so a lot of the processors and the agri-food companies have to reduce their scope 3, as they're called, emissions now. So really, I think, and we have talked to a number of them recently, and they understand this and are trying to decarbonize their supply chains. But I think certainly. I think the processors and it's going to be vital that they're involved. If they want to reduce their scope 3 emissions, they're going to have to help incentivize on-farm reduction, because that's where the majority of the emissions are occurring for the production of the produce that they're selling.
A question there in terms of with emissions only at 1 point, or reductions only at 1.2% in 2022, and a need for 4.8%. What measures have most impact on low stocked, extensive, and low nitrogen using farming going forward?
And this is always a big challenge for farms that don't use a whole lot of nitrogen, and that are quite lowly stocked. So what I would say is that you take your typical suckler beef farm, they're probably only applying around about 60 to 70 kilos of nitrogen per hectare on average. That's what's come out of the National Farm Survey. I would contend that a farm that is doing that probably doesn't need to apply any mineral nitrogen if you've got your pH right and again, getting some legumes into the sward. And then I think it's about optimizing your animal health. It's about looking at your maternal traits in terms of fertility, looking at your terminal traits in terms of live weight gain, and really optimizing, optimizing those traits so that you can then start to reduce finishing times.
The question here that the national herd reduced by 4.6% between 2022 and 2023. I haven't seen figures for 23. It might be 21 and 22, but is that the sort of decrease that's projected forward, and is it consistent with what's been happening over the last number of years?
It's not consistent with what's been happening, but it is consistent. So what has been consistent is there's been a consistent increase in dairy cow numbers over the last number of years. There's been a consistent decrease in suckler numbers over the last, quite a number of years. And I think, again, we project that those trends will continue. So, by 2030, we will have actually less total number of bovines in the country than we have at the moment. We'll have slightly more dairy cows and slightly less suckler cows. So and they're simply the trends that have been ongoing for the last number of years.
Quick question, maybe it's not very quick. How do feed additives affect the animals?
They don't. So in general, the good and the bad thing about 3-UP is that it doesn't last very long in the animal. So in fact, that's why in general the science that has gone on has been on TMR diets, because it needs to be fed little and often to animals, because it breaks down in the body very, very quickly. So in fact, there has been studies, and there is literally there's no trace can be found in either milk or in meat produce. So there's no impact on the animals. There has been, with some of these inhibitors that have been fed, there's some indications that there's an increase in productivity because you're not losing carbon as methane. So the carbon can be used instead for milk or meat production. But they're small levels, so it's a fairly mixed bag as to whether there's really any increase in productivity.
Question there: if we're to get the increase, just one last one, the increase in AD, do you envisage that will be farm scale or industrial scale?
No, industrial scale. It'll really be industrial scale. So, whilst there might be some farm scale AD systems, which might be combined heat and power systems, I think what we're looking at here is large scale systems that are producing large commercial amounts of biomethane that can be either fed directly onto the grid or can be tanked and used as LPG or used in electricity generation.
We've had a number of presentations on AD from Gas Network Ireland and our own colleagues in Teagasc. So encourage people to have a look through those, and they do show the targets that are being set out there quite clearly. We're out of time, unfortunately, Gary, and we do have more questions coming through, but sadly we just don't have the time this morning. Gary, really appreciate the really very clear presentation. That's been very clear in all the comments coming through, that people appreciated that clarity that may not have always been there in the past when it comes to trying to interpret these MACC curves, but I think it was very, very clear in the way you presented it this morning. Before we finish this morning, I want to just take this opportunity to say a very special thank you and best wishes to our former colleague Andy Boland, who has recently retired from Teagasc. Andy was a cornerstone of the Signpost webinar series, and you'll see in the credits he's still appearing there as one of the producers of the series, and has been really instrumental in the organization of the series and sourcing speakers. And we just want to acknowledge that enormous effort that Andy has put into the series over the last number of years, and to wish Andy well in his retirement. Pat, I'm sure you'd like to echo that.
Absolutely.
So thanks to Andy, and best of luck in your new endeavors. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Catherine Keena, who's going to be discussing planting and managing hedgerows, because we are moving into that time of the year where hedgerow planting season. And the next week's webinar will be the start of National Hedgerow Week, and there'll be a series of events and publications and social media around hedgerow planting to prepare for the season coming up. So please do join us for that. And also, we've been asked to remind people that the RDS Forestry Awards are still open for applications. Today was the deadline, but I understand that deadline has been extended. So if you want to look that up, it's go onto the RDS website, and the Farm Forest Awards and Woodlands Awards are open to applications. I imagine it'll be open for another week or two, but do get your applications in now if you are interested in participating in those awards. So until next week, thanks for tuning in. And Gary, thanks again for your presentation, and have a good weekend.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.